the empire that collapsed from salt. History remembers Rome as one of the greatest empires humanity had ever seen. Massive stone roads stretched across continents. Roman armies conquered kingdoms, and giant cities overflowed with wealth, trade, and power. To the ancient world, Rome looked unstoppable. It seemed too powerful to ever truly collapse. But history hides a terrifying truth about civilizations. The greatest empires rarely fall because of one dramatic battle. Most collapse slowly from invisible weaknesses, spreading beneath the surface for years. And in Rome's case, one of those hidden weaknesses was something incredibly simple: salt. Before refrigeration existed, preserving food was one of humanity's biggest challenges. Meat spoiled quickly. Fish rotted within days. Entire communities could starve if food supplies failed during winter or war. Salt changed everything. By preserving meat and fish, civilizations could store food for months. Armies could march farther. Traders could travel longer distances. And cities could survive shortages. Salt became more valuable than most people today can imagine. Some societies traded it like gold. Rome understood its importance perfectly. The empire built roads specifically for transporting salt, including the famous Via Salaria, or Salt Road. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid with money meant to buy salt, which is where the word salary comes from. Salt was not just seasoning. It was economic power, military strength, and survival itself. Rome's greatest strength was not only its armies. Its true power came from organization. The empire connected enormous territories into one giant economic system. Grain from Egypt fed Roman cities. Olive oil arrived from Hispania. Wine traveled from Gaul. Ships crossed the Mediterranean, carrying preserved fish, salted meat, and countless other goods. Salt stood at the center of this entire network because preservation made long-distance trade possible. Without preserved food, Rome's supply chains would collapse almost immediately. Armies stationed near dangerous frontiers depended on preserved supplies to survive. Warehouses stored food for emergencies, while roads allowed rapid transportation across the empire. At its peak, Rome controlled one of the most advanced trade systems the ancient world had ever seen. Millions depended on it functioning perfectly every day. But giant systems are fragile. The larger they become, the harder they are to maintain. One failed harvest could suddenly create shortages across multiple provinces. Pirate attacks could disrupt food shipments. Corruption among officials could slow transportation and increase prices. Rome still looked powerful from the outside, but invisible cracks were already forming. The Roman military depended heavily on those systems. History remembers Roman soldiers as unstoppable warriors, but armies do not survive on courage alone. Soldiers require food every single day. Tens of thousands of men marching across forests, deserts, and hostile territory needed enormous supply networks. Roman military success depended heavily on logistics. Preserved food became one of the empire's greatest strategic advantages. Forts and storage facilities were built near important roads to protect military supplies. Roman engineers designed transportation routes. But maintaining those systems became increasingly difficult over time. As Rome expanded farther across Europe and the Middle East, supply lines stretched across unstable territories. Enemies realized they did not always need to defeat Roman armies directly. Sometimes attacking food supplies was enough. Corruption also spread among officials, managing transportation and taxation. Supplies disappeared before reaching their destinations. Maintaining military infrastructure became increasingly expensive, yet the empire depended on constant expansion and endless resources just to survive. Then nature itself began turning against Rome. For centuries, the empire benefited from stable climate conditions that allowed agriculture to flourish. But slowly, climate patterns changed. Temperatures cooled. Rainfall became unpredictable. Some regions suffered droughts, while others experienced destructive flooding. Harvest failures became increasingly common. At first, Romans likely believed these problems were temporary. But the environmental instability continued year after year. Agricultural production declined across important provinces. Food shortages spread. Salt production also became harder to maintain because coastal salt works depended on stable environmental conditions and labor systems that were beginning to weaken. Rome suddenly faced a terrifying problem. The empire needed food preservation systems more than ever because shortages were growing. Yet the transportation and economic networks supporting those systems were collapsing at the same time. Climate pressure intensified every weakness. Famine spread slowly across the empire like an invisible disease. First came poor harvests, then rising bread prices. Families skipped meals to survive difficult seasons. Farmers abandoned land they could no longer afford to work. Rural populations migrated toward cities searching for food and safety. But the cities themselves were struggling. Rome depended heavily on imported grain from Egypt and North Africa, and when those supplies failed, millions immediately faced shortages. Hunger weakened populations while crime and riots increased. Entire communities became trapped in cycles of starvation and desperation. Malnutrition also made diseases far more deadly. Epidemics spread through overcrowded urban centers already weakened by food shortages. Trade slowed further as populations declined and local economies collapsed. Salt could preserve food, but preservation meant little if there was not enough food left to preserve. Rome's foundation had always depended on abundance. Now abundance was disappearing. At the same time, the Roman economy itself was beginning to rot from within. Maintaining roads, armies, cities, and trade systems required enormous wealth. For centuries, Rome funded these costs through conquest and expansion. Victories brought treasure, taxes, and resources into the empire. But eventually expansion slowed. Rome still carried all the costs of maintaining a giant empire without gaining enough new wealth to support it. Economic decline accelerated rapidly. Emperors responded by reducing silver content in Roman coins while pretending the currency still held the same value. Inflation spiraled out of control. Prices exploded. Merchants lost trust in Roman money. Citizens began hoarding food and resources instead of participating in trade. Taxes became crushing, especially for farmers. Many abandoned their land completely because survival became impossible. Corruption spread across nearly every level of government. Officials stole tax money and supplies before they reached cities or armies. Rome entered a deadly cycle where every attempt to solve problems created even larger crises. As society weakened, so did the Roman army. Recruiting soldiers became increasingly difficult because ordinary citizens no longer trusted the empire. Rome relied more heavily on foreign mercenaries, whose loyalty depended entirely on payment. Equipment quality declined. Soldiers sometimes went unpaid for long periods. Corruption and rebellion spread inside the military itself. Worst of all, Rome's logistical superiority began collapsing. Preserved food became harder to transport consistently as trade routes weakened. Frontier defenses became vulnerable. Enemy tribes noticed immediately. Goths, Vandals, Huns, and other groups began pushing into Roman territory. The empire that once terrified the world was slowly losing its ability to defend itself. By the final centuries of the Western Roman Empire, cities were shrinking, roads had become dangerous, trade was collapsing, and political chaos consumed the government. Emperors rose and fell constantly through assassinations and military coups. Trust in leadership disappeared almost completely. Starvation and disease devastated civilian populations, while armies struggled to protect unstable borders. In 476 AD, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire was removed from power. But Rome had already been collapsing for generations. The breakdown happened slowly, piece by piece, crisis by crisis. Salt became a symbol of that hidden dependency. A simple mineral that once helped preserve food, sustain armies, and fuel trade eventually revealed how fragile Rome truly was. The empire believed itself eternal. Most civilizations do. Yet history proves again and again that no society is invincible. When the invisible systems supporting survival begin to fail. And maybe that is why the fall of Rome still fascinates the world today. Because deep down, it forces humanity to confront an uncomfortable possibility. If an empire as powerful as Rome could slowly collapse from hidden weaknesses, almost nobody noticed in time, then perhaps no civilization is truly immune from the same fate.